Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read a lightly edited version of Pioneer Work in Opening the Medical Profession to Women, Autobiographical Sketches by Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, published in 1895. The book will be read in order, so if you would like to begin at the beginning, please start with Season 2, Episode 26. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at Exploration Dreamland. If you would like to recommend a text, please email us at explorationdreamland, all one word, @gmail.com. You can also find our episodes on YouTube. Please subscribe or follow and review us wherever you find us. Your actions will help others find us too. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. Although the residence in La Maternité was an extremely trying one from the utter absence of privacy, the poor air and food, and really hard work when sleep was lost on the average every fifth night, yet the medical experience was invaluable at that period of pioneer effort. It enabled me later to enter upon practice with a confidence in one important branch of medicine that no other period of study afforded, and I have always been glad that I entered the institution, notwithstanding the very grave accident which now befell me. This event was noted at the time as follows. Sunday, November 4. Served all day in the infirmary, and witnessed Monsieur Dayot's first application of the Seraphine. I felt all the afternoon a little grain of sand, as it were, in one eye. I was afraid to think what it might be, for in the dark early morning, whilst syringing the eye of one of my tiny patients for purulent ophthalmia, some of the water had spurted into my own eye. It was much swollen at night, and in the morning the lids were closely adherent from separation. November 5. I applied for permission to leave until the eye was well and was refused. I went to the infirmary of the Élève and informed Monsieur Bloch that I was prisoner. He examined the eye carefully, discovered that it was the dreaded disease, consulted his chief, and then told me that as everything depended on the early active treatment, he should give up the first days entirely to me. He expressed much sympathy, arranged everything for me in the most thoughtful way, and I went to bed, I little knew for how long. I dispatched a note to my sister, and then active treatment commenced. The eyelids cauterized, leeches to the temple, cold compresses, ointment of belladonna, opium to the forehead, purgatives, foot baths, and synepisms with broth for diet. The eye was syringed every hour, and I realized the danger of the disease from the weapons employed against it. Poor Anna came down in the evening to sympathize with the inflamed eye I had written about, and was dreadfully shocked. She has told me since how many times she hid behind the curtain to cry. My friendly young doctor came every 2 hours, day and night, to tend the eye, Mademoiselle Mallet acting in the alternate hours. The infirmary was kept profoundly quiet, and a guard appointed day and night. The sympathy was universal and deep, the élève asking after me with tears. An unheard-of permission was granted to Anna to visit me 3 times a day. For 3 days this continued, then the disease had done its worst, and I learned from the tone of my friends that my eye was despaired of. Ah, how dreadful it was to find the daylight gradually fading as my kind doctor bent over me and removed with an exquisite delicacy of touch the films that had formed over the pupil. I could see him for a moment clearly, but the sight soon vanished, and the eye was left in darkness. For 3 weeks I lay in bed with both eyes closed. Then the right eye began to open gradually, and I could get up and do little things for myself. How kind everybody was! I shall never forget it. Anna, with her faith in magnetism, came down regularly 3 times a day, in rain and snow, to sympathize and impart the vital fluid. My friendship deepened for my young physician, and I planned a little present for his office. Madame Charrier entered into it with spirit. We had long discussions together, and finally secured an elegant pair of lamps for his consultation rooms, which I hurried through the corridors to see, bundled up in my dressing gown and shawl, looking and feeling very much like a ghost. The lamps were conveyed to his room that night. The next morning he came to me evidently full of delight and longing to be amiable, yet too conscientious to infringe the rules of the maternité by acknowledging the present. He admired my braid of long hair, wondered how fingers without eyes could arrange anything so beautifully regular, spoke of the Protestant religion, thought if he joined any church it would be that, turned to go, turned back again, and was evidently hardly able to leave without thanking me. Mademoiselle Mallet told me that the night before he had run in to Madame Charrier to tell her of his present, and on his way out passed by the cloisters in an evident perplexity, longing to enter the infirmary of the élève, but unable to do so. I do admire his delicate conscientiousness. I received a visit from Monsieur Davin, who had sent me a message of sympathy. I could not clearly make him out with my dim eye, but had a general idea of a short, elderly man, standing, hat in hand, and regarding me as one would a solemn religious spectacle. Monsieur Boivin made some very friendly remarks to me, and concluded, raising his hand, "Et voyez-vous? C'est d'une patience?" "Angélique," replied Monsieur Davin. Saturday, 22nd. Oh, how happy I am at this moment, for Dubois has just left me, understanding for the first time the justice of my determination to obtain a full medical education, and obliged to confess that I was right in principle. I shall have my congé and a hope of clinics and study in the eccentric hospitals. Heaven has answered that heart cry of the other night. Wednesday, 26th. Off, actually. I dressed for the first time. Bandaged and veiled, the carriage drove to the door. Anna guided me in. I made kind adieus, caught glimpses of stone walls in the cold, dull light, and thus ended my maternité life. I felt very weak and laughed hysterically the whole evening. The following letter, written at this time to an uncle an officer in the British Army, shows the important support which the mind can render the body in combating disease. Dear Uncle, I thank you with all my heart for the kind sympathy you have expressed for me so warmly. Fate certainly gave me a strange and sudden blow, but now I am up again, strong and hopeful, and eager for work, and I beg Uncle to feel quite sure that a brave soldier's niece will never disgrace the colors she fights under, but will be proud of the wounds gained in a great cause, and resolve more strongly than ever to conquer or die. In truth, dear friends, the accident might have been so much worse that I am more disposed to rejoice than to complain. Even in its present state, the eye is not a very striking disfigurement, and it will gradually become still less so. As to the more serious consideration, loss of vision, I still hope to recover that in time, and meanwhile the right eye grows daily stronger. I can write without difficulty, read a little, and hope soon to resume my usual employments. I certainly esteem myself very fortunate, and I still mean to be at no very distant day the first lady surgeon in the world. I find from your letters that there is a possibility of your visiting Paris. I should rejoice in the prospect of meeting you if my own stay were certain, but it is by no means so. I have already accomplished much in France, but I find it very difficult to proceed further. Still, I cannot yet judge decidedly of my prospects. I have just received permission from government to visit the hospitals, which is encouraging, and one opening may lead to others, so that I may still hope to meet you some day, unless you should grow frightened at the idea of my scalpel and lancet, and feel uncertain how far the ties of relationship may modify the experimental researches of the medical student. Believe me, very truly, your niece, Elizabeth Blackwell. But the 6 months which followed my departure from the maternité proved to be a time of great mental suffering, under which a strong physical constitution threatened to give way, for the condition of the affected organ entirely prevented that close application to professional study which was needed. Both anatomical and surgical work were out of the question, and even reading had to be laid aside. I followed a few lectures and some cliniques at the Hôtel Dieu by permission of M. Roux, and engaged a répétiteur, but this was quite inadequate to accomplish the end in view. In June of 1850, a visit to the fine mountain air of Priesnitz's famous establishment at Gräfenberg was resolved on, in the hope of regaining strength and power of study. Traveling rapidly through France, Germany, and Prussia, in 5 days I reached the famous water-cure region. On the journey, a day had been spent in Berlin, where I had been struck by the arrogance of the Prussian officers and the fear which was expressed by a friend with whom I talked freely in Kroll's garden, lest conversation should be overheard. Freiwaldau, at the foot of the Gräfenberg, was full of Kurgast, but being warned by a lady to whom I brought an introduction that it would be impossible for a lady to go alone to the Gräfenberg Hotel, for it was full of gentlemen who went about in their shirt-sleeves, I was rather perplexed as to where to go. A home letter describes this curious experience. Gräfenberg, 3 p.m. On a shady seat on the brow of a hill commanding a most beautiful prospect. Dearly beloved people, this cometh to you from a very watery person in a very watery place. The sound of water is heard everywhere, But I must give you some particulars. Not being able to find lodgings in Freiwaldau, I left word for Priestnitz to call, and was sitting in my little upper room at the hotel, feeling decidedly blue, when the door opened, and in walked a middle-sized elderly man with sunburnt face marked with smallpox, with grey hair, light blue eyes, a pleasant expression of face, and dressed in country-best style. I liked his appearance, 'twas honest and good. He examined me very closely with his little blue eyes all the time I was explaining my wishes. Then, in his abrupt manner, he told me he could make me quite strong in about 6 weeks, and the cure would do no harm to my eye. When I told him that I was informed Gräfenberg was quite full, he said, "You can come, child, come this afternoon, and bring your things with you." And off he went. I felt quite relieved to be spared the bother of lodging hunting and housekeeping. I determined to face the innumerable gentlemen in shirt-sleeves and let properness go. If the Gräfin did not like my position, why, she might dislike it. When I reached the place of my destination, I was a little confounded. At the very top of the house, with bare rafters for the roof and the wall, a row of little windows a foot high let into the roof above my head, a wooden crib full of straw, 3 wooden chairs, a table, a low bureau with a green earthenware bowl. This was my room and its furniture. I must have looked rather dismayed, for the girl hastened to inform me that I had an Italian count and countess for my next-door neighbors, and that there were 8 ladies and 8 gentlemen on the same floor, and that we should be out in the woods all day. Of course I could say nothing when I found I had such noble neighbors, or rather when I found that it was really the last vacant room in the house. When the bell rang for tea, I was shown into an immense hall that might seat 500 people, gaily painted and ornamented with chandeliers. I sat down and found myself, to my utter amazement, beside a row of ladies in grand toilette gossamer dresses with short sleeves and waists a little lower than I thought waists were ever worn, hair dressed out with curls and flowers, bracelets, I counted 5 on the arm next to me, and rings to match. The long tables were covered with alternate bowls of sour and sweet milk, and brown bread and butter. The bread looked inviting, but when, with difficulty, I had sawn off a morsel, it was so sour that I could hardly swallow it. But the milk was good, and I did it justice. People kept coming in groups, very merry, but all talking German. The gentlemen, I presume, were in shirt-sleeves, but as they were all covered with coats, I was not shocked. The next morning early, I went through a series of hydropathic operations, at which Priestnitz assisted, as he always does the first time. The course never varied, viz. Packing, a half-bath, a plunge bath, a wet bandage, and some glasses of cold water at 6 o'clock in the morning, an Abreibung, sitz bath, and another wet bandage at 12 o'clock, ditto at 4 p.m., and water ad libitum all through the day. The diet is plain, but every morning an old woman opens a white bread shop outside the dining room, to which almost everyone is customer. Each one comes in from the early morning walk, buys a roll, and marches in with it under his arm, and morning and evening the little strawberry gatherers offer the alpine strawberries, with their fine wildwood flavor, for sale. Everybody seems to have a good appetite. My own is ravenous, a half day in the open air, rambling over these fine mountainsides, stimulated by the wind and the abundant, really living water, I find myself suddenly in strong, vigorous health, and the idea of sickness seems a fable. At first, I felt very lonely in such a large assembly, but now I speak to a good many, and I have found one young American, Mr. Glynn, who seems like a brother in this concourse of strangers. He is about 22, nearly blind from amaurosis, but one of the smartest fellows I have ever met. Quick as a flash, full of Yankee shrewdness, he bears his terrible misfortune with real heroism and has rendered me numberless little services. There are several mountainsides laid out with walks innumerable. The favorite early morning walk is to the Priesnitz spring. You wind round and up the mountain, partly through open, sweet-smelling fields, partly through pleasant fir woods, passing several springs by the way, each with its name and inscription, and rustic seats around. At each you stop and drink, chat a little with those you meet, and perhaps sit down for a few moments. It is very sweet at this hour. The leaves smell so fresh, the beautiful flowers are covered with dew, and the cuckoo is heard in the woods all day. This stroll generally occupies 2 hours. It is very amusing to watch the people. Gräfenberg is the rage in Germany. All classes are represented here. The Countess von Westalp offers to introduce me to a fashionable English circle in Freiwaldau, headed by Lady Darley, and to our great indignation, the butcher Haynau, notorious for his barbarities, made his appearance here one day. In the house we have gymnasium, billiard room, library, theatre, and balls frequently take place. Priesnitz has 500 patients under his care, and with their friends they amount to hundreds more. You see him sitting at the head of one of the large tables 3 times a day, looking very pleasant. He is quiet and simple in manner, but has a very determined mouth. They say he is proud of having been an Austrian serf. His pleasant-looking daughter is married to a Hungarian baron. These foreign titles are really a farce. I am here in my loft one day, in slippers and old dressing-gown, when a knock comes to my door. When I open it, a tall, black-whiskered foreigner appears, who presents the respects of Madame la Princesse Obolenska, and hopes I will call upon her when I next go to Freiwaldau. The man made quite sure that I was I, as well he might, for I never had quite such queer surroundings. I paid my visit, a professional one after all. I had to put up with 4 gulden instead of the honor, but she was a simple, pleasant lady, and we parted on the pleasantest terms. This was, in fact, my first regular professional consultation. The air and water, however, of that lovely region, with the constant outdoor life and endless rambles over the Bohemian mountain-sides, proved too stimulating to the still sensitive organ. A violent attack of inflammation supervened. With great difficulty I returned to Paris and placed myself under the care of the famous oculist Desmarres. This gentleman rendered me the most skilful and generous aid. In the course of a few weeks he restored me to active work again, although the sight of one eye was permanently lost and the intention of making surgery a specialty necessarily abandoned. During this trying period of Parisian study, my cousin, Mr. Kenyon Blackwell, a South Staffordshire ironmaster, was endeavouring to promote my strong desire to study in one of our London hospitals. He applied to the able and highly esteemed Dean of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, who presented the application to the treasurer. The subject was referred to the medical council of the hospital. The result was forwarded to me as follows. At a House committee held on Tuesday, the 14th day of May, 1850, a letter addressed to the treasurer from Mr. Paget, communicating to him the request of Miss Elizabeth Blackwell, a lady well connected in this country and the United States, to attend as a student in the wards and other departments of the hospital, was read, when the treasurer reported that the same had been referred to the medical council, and the opinion of all the members of the council having been read, and Mr. Paget having attended and furnished the committee with such information as was required, it was resolved that in the opinion of this committee, Miss Blackwell should be admitted as a student under such regulations as the treasurer and almoners may from time to time deem necessary. James Paget, Esquire. The ticket of admission forwarded at the same time granted permission to study in any ward and follow the visit of any physician or surgeon who was willing to extend to me the facilities of his department. The permission was accompanied by a cordial welcome from the Dean, Mr. James Paget, M.R.C.S. This was indeed joyful news. I could now, in an open and honorable way, no longer regarded with suspicion, but protected by the highest medical sanction, devote myself to the unlimited field of practical medicine so cordially thrown open to me, and which I ardently desired to study. I hastened to London, and after some little difficulty in obtaining lodgings, on account of being a lady alone, established myself in rooms in Thavies Inn, then a delightfully quiet set of houses, entered by an archway from busy Holborn. Every morning after breakfast I now regularly betook myself to the hospital, spending many hours there daily, and making the Faith wards, under Dr. Burrows, my headquarters, but Messrs. Lawrence, Stanley, and Lloyd courteously welcomed me to their wards. Indeed, every department was cordially opened to me, except the department for female diseases. Kind old Dr. Hugh was always ready to show me cases of interest, and he took me by an underground passage which led to Christ's Hospital to taste the famous pea soup made for the lads of that old foundation school. I particularly valued the special visits of clinical observation, without students, which Dr. Bailey and Mr. Kirkes were making. Mr. Kirkes was preparing a new edition of his excellent Students' Physiology, and Dr. Bailey was pursuing his valuable investigations on dysentery. In relation to the latter, it is noted in my journal, "He is so gentle, so friendly, and so learned in his art that he teaches me more than anyone else." I also attended Mr. Paget's admirable lectures on pathological anatomy, given in the amphitheatre. My seat there was always courteously reserved for me. I experienced also the utmost consideration from the students, a large class of whom always followed Dr. Burrows's visits. Indeed, so natural did this innovation of a lady student soon become, that when, the following year, I paid my farewell visit to the treasurer, he remarked, to my great gratification, "Why, we had quite forgotten you were here." Many home letters mark the various incidents of this extremely interesting period of study. London, 28 Thavies Inn, November 1. Dear friends, when I arrived in London on October 3, I was actually dismayed by the intolerable atmosphere, the dense envelope of foggy smoke that made me sick during the day and kept me awake at night. And as I continued to make observations on persons and things, and finally settled down in my present prosaic lodgings, I asked myself with astonishment, is this the same London I saw a year and a half ago, or is it a different person examining the same objects? But now, happily, that state of forlornity has passed away. I have almost forgotten the smoke. My lodgings are clean and convenient. I am making friends, and I shall use all the opportunities I can get for studying social subjects and seeing society, provided they do not interfere with my work and are not too expensive. My first introduction to St. Bartholomew's was at a breakfast at Mr. Paget's. He has a house within the hospital boundaries and a special oversight of the students. At the commencement of each session, he invites the students to breakfast in parties of about a dozen, and to one of those breakfasts I, on my arrival, was invited. The students seemed to be gentlemanly fellows, and looked with some curiosity at their new companion. The conversation was general and pleasant, the table well covered, Mrs. Paget very sensible and agreeable, so that it was quite a satisfactory time. Soon after, I was invited to meet a distinguished German gentleman, Professor Kuliker, whom I found most agreeable and intelligent. My old acquaintance, Professor Owen, entertained us with traditions of London. Dr. Carpenter was also present, and some of the older students, looking very amiable though awkward. The gentlemen I find more friendly than the ladies. I fear I shall find them in the shocked phase this winter. There are, however, a few decided exceptions. But now I am going to tell Mother of a visit which I made yesterday on purpose to amuse her, viz. to our old Bridge Street minister, Dr. Lifechild, whose christening of me I distinctly remember. Between 3 and 4, on my return from hospital, I set out determined to hunt up the family, and after searching directories and trudging several miles, and being wrongly directed, when I finally inquired at No. 5 Camden Street, a quiet, respectable house, whether Dr. Lifechild was in, I listened with great relief to the announcement that he was probably taking his nap. I was ushered into a large, plainly furnished parlor, where sat Mrs. Lifechild, sewing by a round table in the middle. My childish recollection had retained a general impression of the person, though I should not have recognized her. She is 72 and wearing spectacles, but does not look more than 50, so fresh, plump, and pretty, though unfortunately so deaf that she could only hear an occasional word. I announced myself. She replied, "I remember the family well. Mr. Blackwell was deacon in the chapel. You are one of his sisters." I could hardly make her believe that I was third daughter. She remembered A and M well, said they were clever girls. She knew they would turn out something remarkable, but she had no recollection of me. Their son John came in at that moment, a tall, thin man, reminding me of the Lane Seminary student Jones. I don't know whether I ever saw him before. Of course the doctor was sent for to see the stranger. I recognized him at once, and should have known him anywhere, fat, rosy, and laughing, notwithstanding his grey hair. I did not detect anything of the old man in him. "Ah," said he, "I know that face." And then he made me take my bonnet off and occupy a large chair by the fire, and tell him all about the family, and particularly my mother. A sweet creature she was, How I should like to see her again. Doesn't she talk about visiting England? I wish she would." He spoke of father with great affection, as a true friend. He had received most beautiful letters from him. If my memoirs are published, one of his letters will appear in them. They had been told that the two eldest Miss Blackwells were very dashing girls and wanted to know the truth. Then why had I come to England? I told him I had been doing a rather singular thing. I had been studying medicine. He looked at me to see if I were in earnest, and then burst out into such a hearty, merry laugh that I joined in with all my might. Yes, I had obtained a diploma as doctor in medicine. "You, doctor!" And then another hearty laugh. Of course, Mrs. Lifechild wanted to know what we were laughing at. "Why, my dear, that girl there is doctor in medicine." And then I must give them the whole history, and I certainly never had 3 more attentive listeners, interrupted by the doctor's exclamations. "Bless me, what she has done! What she has suffered! Why, the girl's a genius! Where did she get it all from? Why, no man could have done what she has done." And if ever I stopped, John would say, "Now, Miss Blackwell, pray go on. It's the most interesting narrative I ever listened to. You left off at Paris." I was much amused. To that little family, who had been staying so quietly at home in the same routine, it did sound like a romance. When I had done, the doctor declared it was a capital thing. It was the beginning of a new era. And John at once brought out pen and paper and begged me to give him my autograph. The doctor said the Reverend Mr. May from America was an old friend and classmate who had visited England about 2 years ago, and he graphically described their interview. When Dr. L. opened the door, he started back. "No. Yes. It isn't. It is. It can't be possible. It is very certain. But won't you let me in?" From Mr. May he learned that the eldest of the Blackwells had become Socinians, and then I must give an account of my religious faith. Of course I spoke up for myself. I told him my religion was certainly a little peculiar, but nevertheless it was a very good and very strong one. And he didn't seem much troubled about the state of my soul. Indeed, I believe that, on the whole, he considered that it was a little safer than most of the ladies of his acquaintance. So, Mother, I beg you to take the same view of the matter. Altogether, I met with the heartiest reception. The doctor placed all his influence at my service, and Mrs. Lifechild will write you all the news of your old Bristol friends, so I hope you approve of my calling. Now I am writing in a queer place, viz. one of the wards of St. Bartholomew's, whilst awaiting the visit of one of the physicians. This famous old hospital is only 5 minutes' walk from my lodgings, and every morning, as the clock strikes 9, I walk down Holborn Hill, make a short cut through the once famous Cock Lane, and find myself at a gate of the hospital that enables me to enter with only a side glance at Smithfield Cattle Market. Punch had really frightened me by his account of the dangerous tumult of animals, but happily I need only glance across the open space, forgetting the bulls, pigs, etc. that occupy it now, and also the fearful fires of persecution once lighted there, and try to bring back the time when it was lined with gay tents and surrounded by galleries filled with beauty, eager to witness the brilliant encounters of arms that took place there in the age of tournaments. Now a little dark figure with doctorial sack and writing case under arm makes its way through assembling students, who politely step aside to let it pass, and entering the museum, studies its numerous preparations till the hour of lecture, when an attendant shows it to a seat. I only attend regularly one course of lectures, viz. Mr. Paget's very interesting course on pathology. Mr. Paget spoke to the students before I joined the class. When I entered and bowed, I received a round of applause. My seat is always reserved for me, and I have no trouble. There are, I think, about 60 students, the most gentlemanly class I have ever seen. I have been here about 10 days. There are so many physicians and surgeons, so many wards, and all so exceedingly busy, that I have not yet got the run of the place. But the medical wards are thrown open unreservedly to me, either to follow the physician's visits or for private study. Later I shall attend the surgical wards. At first, no one knew how to regard me. Some thought I must be an extraordinary intellect overflowing with knowledge, others a queer, eccentric woman, and none seemed to understand that I was a quiet, sensible person who had acquired a small amount of medical knowledge, and who wished by patient observation and study to acquire considerably more. One of the old physicians takes much interest in the strange little doctor, and has given me valuable hints from his own experience, but I confess that this system of practice is both difficult and repellent to me. I shall, however, study it diligently. Mr. Paget, who is very cordial, tells me that I shall have to encounter much more prejudice from ladies than from gentlemen in my course. I am prepared for this. Prejudice is more violent the blinder it is, and I think that Englishwomen seem wonderfully shut up in their habitual views. But a work of the ages cannot be hindered by individual feeling. 100 years hence, women will not be what they are now. The growing perplexity of the conscientious student awakening to the uncertainty of the art of medicine is now apparent in letters written at this time. November 20, 1850. Dear E., I want to talk to you seriously about the future. That is to say, my medical future. It has been a heavy, perplexing subject to me on what system I should practice, for the old one appeared to me wrong, and I have even thought every heresy better. But since I have been looking into these heresies a little more closely, I feel as dissatisfied with them as with the old one. We hear of such wonderful cures continually being wrought by this and the other thing, that we forget on how small a number the novelty has been exercised, and the failures are never mentioned. But on the same principle, I am convinced that if the old system were heresy, and the heresy the established custom, we should hear the same wonders related of the drugs. Neither hydropathy nor mesmerism are what their enthusiastic votaries imagine them to be. At Gräfenberg, I could not hear of one case of perfect cure, and unfortunately the undoubtedly great resources of cold water are not so developed and classified to enable a young practitioner to introduce it, professedly, into his practice. Mesmerism has not converted me since watching its effects on patients. I do wish most heartily that I could discover more of the remedial agency of magnetism, for my conviction is that it ought to be powerfully beneficial in some cases. And as I find they have a magnetic dispensary here in London, I shall try and attend it frequently. I am sorry that I have been unable hitherto to attend more to homeopathy, the third heresy of the present time, but I am trying now to find out opportunities. I have been following now with earnest attention for a few weeks the practice of a very large London hospital, and I find the majority of patients do get well, so I have come to this conclusion, that I must begin with a practice which is old established custom, which has really more expressed science than any other system. But nevertheless, as it dissatisfies me heartily, I shall commence as soon as possible building up a hospital in which I can experiment, and the very instant I feel sure of any improvement, I shall adopt it in my practice, in spite of a whole legion of opponents. Now, E., future partner, what say you? Is it not the only rational course? If I were rich, I would not begin private practice, but would only experiment. As, however, I am poor, I have no choice. I look forward with great interest to the time when you can aid me in these matters, for I have really no medical friend. All the gentlemen I meet seem separated by an invincible, invisible barrier, and the women who take up the subject partially are inferior. It will not always be so. When the novelty of the innovation is past, men and women will be valuable friends in medicine, but for a time that cannot be. I spend now about 3 or 4 hours each day in the wards, chiefly medical, diagnosing disease, watching the progress of cases, and accustoming my ear to the stethoscope. Already, in this short time, I feel that I have made progress, and detect sounds that I could not distinguish on my entrance. I advise you, E., to familiarize yourself with the healthy sounds of the chest. When you go home, auscultate all the family. You will find quite a variety in the sounds, though all may be healthy persons. Lay a cloth over the chest and listen with the ear simply. It is as good as a stethoscope with clean people. I wish I could lend you my little black stethoscope that I brought from the maternité. I have been disappointed in one thing here. The professor of midwifery and the diseases of women and children wrote me a very polite note telling me that he entirely disapproved of a lady's studying medicine, and begging me to consider that his neglecting to give me aid was owing to no disrespect to me as a lady, but to his condemnation of my object. By the by, I must tell you of a scientific explanation of the toughness of meat which I obtained from Mr. Paget's lecture the other morning. It arises from cooking meat during the rigor mortis. Would not that be a delicate suggestion for a squeamish individual? 28 Davies Inn, 1850. Dear Dr. Dixon, I believe that my kind preceptor and earliest medical friend will be interested in a little account of my foreign life. My request for permission to attend St. Bartholomew's Hospital was cordially granted, and I have received a friendly welcome from professors and students. I have the full rights of a student granted to me. I do not attend many of the lectures, but confine my attention chiefly to the practice of the hospital, and at present, more particularly, to the medical practice. If I remain through the summer, I shall gradually extend my visits to the surgical and other wards, as I am particularly anxious to become widely acquainted with disease. I am obliged to feel very skeptical as to the wisdom of much of the practice which I see pursued every day. I try very hard to believe. I continually call up my own inexperience and the superior ability of the physicians whose actions I am watching. But my doubts will not be subdued, and render me the more desirous of obtaining the bedside knowledge of sickness which will enable me to commit heresy with intelligence in the future, if my convictions impel me to it. I hope you will forgive this confession of want of faith, which I do not venture to make to my present instructors, for the English are in general too conservative to have sympathy with unbelief, however honest. I do not find so active a spirit of investigation in the English professors as in the French. In Paris, this spirit pervaded young and old, and gave a wonderful fascination to the study of medicine, which even I, standing only on the threshold, strongly felt. There are innumerable medical societies there, and some of the members are always on the eve of most important discoveries. A brilliant theory is almost proved and creates intense interest. Some new plan of treatment is always exciting attention in the hospitals, and its discussion is widely spread by the immense crowds of students freely admitted. The noble provision of free lectures, supported by the French government, increases this tendency. The distinguished men who fill the chairs in these institutions have all the leisure and opportunity necessary for original investigation, and a receptive audience always ready to reflect the enthusiasm of the teacher. I have often listened to some of these eloquent men in the College of France, their natural eloquence increased by the novelty or brilliant suggestions of the subject, till I shared fully in the enthusiasm of the assembly, and then, in the excited feeling of the moment, I would enter with some friend into the beautiful adjacent garden of the Luxembourg, and, sitting down at the foot of some noble statue, we would prolong the interest by discussion, while the brilliant atmosphere, the trees, the wind and the water, the fine old palace, and the varied groups of people moving amongst the flowers contributed to the charm of the moment, producing some of the intensest pleasurable sensations I have ever enjoyed. I cannot wonder that students throng to Paris instead of to the immense smoke-hidden London. Here there is no excitement. All moves steadily onward, constantly, but without enthusiasm. No theory sets the world on fire till it is well established, and the German observers are much more studied than the French. Everything is stamped by good sense and clear substantial thought. My respect is fully commanded, but I often long for a visit to the College of France and a stroll in the Luxembourg. Whilst devoting all my daytime to the rare advantage of practical study so providentially opened to me, the evenings were in another direction equally delightful and beneficial. I was sitting, one dull afternoon, in my bare lodging-house drawing-room, somewhat regretfully thinking of the bright skies of Paris and pleasant study under the trees of the Luxembourg garden, when the door opened and 3 young ladies entered and introduced themselves as Miss Bessie Rayner Parkes and the Mrs. Lee Smith. This proved the commencement of a lifelong friendship. These ladies were filled with a noble enthusiasm for the responsible and practical work of women in the various duties of life. They warmly sympathized in my medical effort, and were connected with that delightful society of which Lady Noel Byron, Mrs. Follen, Mrs. Jameson, the Herschels, and Faraday were distinguished members, and with which the Reverend Mr. Morris and the Honorable Russell Gurney were in full sympathy. My young friends hung my dull rooms with their charming paintings, made them gay with flowers, and welcomed me to their family circles with the heartiest hospitality. A bright social sun henceforth cheered the somewhat somber atmosphere of my hospital life, for when the day's duties were accomplished, there was always some pleasant social gathering, or some concert or lecture attended with friends to refresh the medical student. I often walked home from my friends in the West between 12 and 1 at night, being too poor to engage cabs, not exhausted, but invigorated for the next day's work. Lady Noel Byron became warmly interested in my studies. I went with her to Faraday's lectures, visited her at Brighton, and she long remained one of my correspondents. One of my most valued acquaintances was Miss Florence Nightingale, then a young lady at home, but chafing against the restrictions that crippled her active energies. Many an hour we spent by my fireside in Thavies Inn, or walking in the beautiful grounds of Embley, discussing the problem of the present and hopes of the future. To her, chiefly, I owed the awakening to the fact that sanitation is the supreme goal of medicine, its foundation and its crown. My acquaintance also with Professor Georgi, the Swedish professor of kinesiopathy and the favorite disciple of Brandt, whose consultation rooms in Piccadilly I often visited, strengthened my faith in the employment of hygienic measures in medicine. When, in later years, I entered into practice, extremely skeptical in relation to the value of drugs and ordinary medical methods, my strong faith in hygiene formed the solid ground from which I gradually built up my own methods of treatment. Looking back upon a long medical life, one of my happiest recollections is of the number of mothers whom I influenced in the healthy education of their children. Stay tuned for the next segment from Pioneer Work in Opening the Medical Profession to Women by Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find this and many other interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.